If you thought your fantasy football season was over, think again. We are talking about the playoffs. Playoffs? Yes, playoffs. Which means fantasy managers looking for that edge in those playoff contests, you have come to the right place. The running back position is particularly challenging this week as teams that punch their ticket to the dance have done a great job limiting production to the running back in fantasy this season. A closer look at the playoff picture shows that 11 of the 14 teams in the field rank inside the top 13 when it comes to fantasy points against. Now don't let that scare you because hey, here at RotoBaller, we are here to help fantasy managers make those tough lineup decisions with our Wildcard Weekend starts and sits at the running back position. Let's talk about those Wildcard Weekend booms and busts, starting with those boom players, and we start with Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles as they take on the Green Bay Packers. When in doubt, just give the ball to Saquon Barkley. After all, it has worked out for the Eagles all season long as Barkley finishes the RB1 in fantasy over a 17-week schedule, producing 355.3 fantasy points and averaging 22.2 fantasy points per contest. That kind of production, you just plug and play, put that in your lineup, set it and forget it regardless of the circumstances. Now saying that, the Packers, they are not amongst those 11 teams that are ranked inside the top 13 when it comes to fantasy running backs and defending the position. Green Bay, they have allowed 22.56 fantasy points per game this season. That's the 13th most. Only the Buffalo Bills have allowed more fantasy points among the playoff teams than the Packers have. Barkley enters Wildcard Weekend coming off career highs in rushing yards with 2,005, rushing touchdowns with 13, and yards per carry, 5.8 yards per attempt. All those numbers could easily have been even higher had he played in week number 18. Sorry, Packers fans. Barkley, he's coming to this contest with fresh legs. This is the season's second meeting between Barkley and the Packers defensive unit. In week number 1, Barkley scored on 3 separate occasions, 2 rushing touchdowns and a receiving touchdown while averaging 4.5 yards per carry on his way to 109 rushing yards down in Brazil. Barkley's production would have been even better this season had it not been for Jalen Hurts limiting Barkley to a 41.5% of the team's carries inside the 5-yard line. Barkley's explosive run rate was 7.2%. That trailed only Derrick Henry and Jahmyr Gibbs amongst backs with at least 160 carries this season. Meanwhile, no back, and I mean this, no back, topped Barkley in terms of rushing yards on runs that went beyond 15 yards. Green Bay, they're going to need to get to Barkley before Barkley gets those legs churning because he has averaged 3.55 yards before contact per attempt this season behind that Eagles offensive line. The second running back that I'm firing up this week, how about Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as they take on the Washington Commanders? Only James Conner has forced more missed tackles this season than Bucky Irving has. His .26 missed tackles forced per attempt led to 54 missed tackles, 626 yards after contact, and a 3.02 yards after contact per attempt. That is the NFL high. Those 626 rushing yards after contact, that accounted for 55.8% of Irving's total rushing yards this season. Not only was Irving a top running back here as far as the rookie class is concerned, but an argument could be made that he has earned the reputation of being an elite back already, regardless of the years of service. He's undoubtedly already turned Rachaad White into an afterthought in Tampa. Since week number 6, Irving has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game. He's ran for over 875 yards, and he's also got 7 rushing touchdowns. He's also been a factor in the passing game with 346 receiving yards on 40 receptions. Washington is the third most favorable matchup for the running back position this week. The Commanders, they have allowed 2,322 total yards and 17 touchdowns to running backs this season, 16 of which have come on the ground. Now the third running back I'm firing up is Kyren Williams of the LA Rams as they take on the Minnesota Vikings. At first, this matchup, it doesn't look great. Minnesota, they've allowed just 19.71 fantasy points per game throughout the season. That's the 9th fewest. However, not everything is what it seems. During the 4 weeks here, between weeks 14 and 17, Minnesota, they've allowed 25.35 fantasy points per game. That's actually the 8th most. Look, this may not be the best matchup on paper, but it's the next best matchup that's available because you're not starting Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin there, or Audric Estime. That's a favorable matchup against the Bills, except none of these backs for the Denver Broncos are favorable. In fantasy, we are talking about touchdowns here. We want those touchdowns, and few do it better than Kyren Williams has, who has hit pay dirt 31 times over the last 2 seasons. Williams not only found his way in the end zone 16 times this season, but he also ran for 1,299 yards, averaging 4.11 yards per carry, while forcing 42 missed tackles, accounting for 606 yards after contact. We now have 2 years of production from Williams. Those 31 touchdowns, 2,443 rushing yards, and an average of 17.6 fantasy points per game. Now is not the time to get cute. Now is not the time for fantasy managers to bet against Kyren Williams. Now, running backs I am betting against, how about Najee Harris and the Pittsburgh Steelers as they take on the Baltimore Ravens? I mentioned that the running back position, it is not great for fantasy football matchups during the playoffs. Najee Harris, he's got himself an uphill battle facing the Baltimore Ravens yet again. Harris has seen 31 opportunities in 2 games against this Ravens defense this season. He has produced just 135 total yards with those opportunities, and that's worked out to about 8.75 fantasy points per game. Now, to Harris's credit, he's played all 17 games this season. He's churned out over 1,000 yards on the ground on 263 carries. He's also added 283 yards on 36 receptions. As for the Ravens, they were allowing just 80.1 rushing yards per game this season and only 77 rushing yards per game over the last 3 contests. One area in which the Steelers may find a measure of success this week is in the passing game, as the Ravens have allowed 674 receiving yards to opposing backs this season, which happens to be the 4th most. Despite the receiving yardage yielded, Baltimore, they've allowed only 19.29 fantasy points per game. That is the 7th fewest in 2024. Another running back that you have to sit this week, it's Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings as they take on the Los Angeles Rams. The LA Rams, they have been good against opposing backs. They haven't been great, but they've been good. They're 21.22 fantasy points surrendered. That's the 13th fewest, as they've allowed 1,765 rush yards and 582 receiving yards to the position this season. So how come I have Jones on my sit list? Well, again, weeks 14 through 17, those final 4 contests there as far as we consider the playoff matchups, Los Angeles, they've allowed just 77 rushing yards per game and just 113 total receiving yards to the position. The Rams also did not allow a back to register a touchdown over that 4-week window, limiting the position to 14.28 fantasy points per game. Only the Eagles and the Buccaneers allowed fewer fantasy points over that period. Even looking at week number 18, Zach Charbonnet of the Seahawks, he was held to under 60 yards. Now the final running back that I'm sitting, it is J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers as they take on the Houston Texans. J.K. Dobbins, great story. He should be considered one of the front runners for the NFL Comeback Player of the Year award, rushing for 905 yards and breaking 1,000 total yards thanks to his 153 receiving yards on 32 receptions this season. That's all great. Now, Dobbins, he's likely to earn a majority of the opportunities once again against the Texans this week. But considering that the only depth in the running back room here from the Chargers standpoint is Ezekiel Elliott, that's not really saying a whole heck of a lot. Now, as far as fantasy is concerned, only the Chiefs and the Eagles allowed fewer fantasy points to the running back position than the Texans have this season. That's 18.72. Fantasy points, they are going to be tough to come by on the ground, as the Texans have allowed just 10 total touchdowns to the position this season. Meanwhile, they have allowed 31 receiving touchdowns, which may suit Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey just fine. And speaking of suiting your needs, head over to RotoBaller.com today and make sure you get all the latest news and fantasy analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel. You'll catch me there 24/7 answering all your fantasy football questions. See you next time.